After 18 years of conflict in Afghanistan, the announcement of a peace agreement between the U.S. and Taliban is now expected before September the 1st. However, despite the ongoing U.S.-Taliban talks, the violence continues amidst a 2019 Afghan presidential election campaign. So will a U.S.-Taliban peace process end the bloodshed in Afghanistan? How likely is it that U.S. troop withdrawal will bring peace and stability to the nation? And will the former enemies, the Afghan government and the Taliban, be able to work together and rebuild Afghanistan? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Wang Shida, Associate Research Fellow and Deputy Director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. We shall also speak to Peter Kuznick, Professor of History and Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute of American University, via Skype in Washington, D.C., and speak via satellite to Laluma Nasri, co-founder and Vice President of Afghanistan Justice Organization, and Ahmed Shuja Jemelle, the Director of Peace and Reconciliation at the Afghan National Security Council. They are both in Kabul. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Wang. The presidential elections have been started. What are your expectations for the outcome?
Frankly speaking, after 2001, we already have 3 rounds of elections. First in 2004, second in 2009, and the last one it happened in 2014. So this is the 4th elections. To me, I think this election have a very special importance because it is the first election after 2014. Why? Because 2014 is time that the Afghan National Security Forces independently assume their security responsibility, so that it is a very important election. From another perspective, because you see peace and smooth political power transfer is a precondition of peace and stability of Afghanistan. I think this year's election means a lot for the future of Afghan political situation.
Right, thank you so much. Let me cross over to Ahmed Shah Jemelle, Director of Peace and Reconciliation at the Afghan National Security Council. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Jemelle. My first question is, again, your expectations about the deliverables of the presidential campaign. Do you think it's likely to move forward without being disrupted by the Taliban, which fails to have a constructive dialogue with those in power at this moment?
Thank you for having me on the show. The Afghan government is absolutely committed to fulfill the constitutional obligation that the elections be held every 5 years so that a peaceful transfer of power can take place. There is no alternative to having elections. The Afghan government is committed to holding them on time in a fair and transparent manner by the Independent Election Commission of Afghanistan. This is also the year when the Afghan government is actually funding the bulk of the operational expenses of the elections. The Taliban, on the other hand, have threatened to derail the process, which they've tried to do in the past as well, but the Afghan National Security Forces are on alert and they've built up plans, and they're going to even beef up those plans even further as election approaches so we can safeguard our institutional processes, our democratic processes, because there is no other alternative for a peaceful transfer of power other than an election, which is enshrined in our constitution, and we're obligated to hold them on time.
But Jemelle, I'm afraid the violence in Kabul is real on the ground. For example, when people are going to the polls in Afghanistan, it's going to be an issue of life and death, make or break. On July the 28th, for example, the office of an Afghan vice presidential candidate was attacked, and 20 people were killed and 50 wounded. Are you worried that such an election would be very bloody and expensive?
The Taliban have made their threats that they're going to derail not just election day, but also election rallies. Let me tell you something, number of statistics that is going to illustrate, I think, the resolve of the Afghan security forces for the length they're willing to go to prevent violence from derailing this process. In the first 6 months of 2019, the Afghan security forces have seized at least 27 tons of explosives in multiple provinces in this country. They've also they've also neutralized and dismissed about 20,000 unexploded ordnances, IEDs planted by the Taliban and others, thus saving a countless number of lives. The government has also reached more than 13,000 families displaced as a result of the violence that the Taliban are bringing up to the villages and to the towns of this country. The Taliban are indiscriminately attacking civilians in a way that we have not seen in the past. But so are the Afghan National Security Forces, who are beefing up their operations to disrupt their cells, to dismantle their IEDs, and to safeguard the Afghan people on election day, which is an important historic moment, because for the first time we're doing this primarily funded by ourselves and in a way that is during a time when the war is actually being carried out for the most part by the Afghan security forces themselves, with very little combat support from the international forces.
To have a clear understanding about what's going on the ground in Afghanistan, let me quickly go over to Afghanistan, where we have Madam Laluma Nasri, co-founder of and the vice president of Afghan Justice Organization, standing by there. Hello, Laluma. What are your considerations and expectations on the election this year?
Thank you. Yes, the election campaigns kicked off recently, but what we see as witnesses here in Kabul and also at the country level, not much energy is existing in the current election campaigns. And that's for the reason that the current ongoing peace negotiations or peace talks between the US and the Taliban are also ongoing, and that has overshadowed the elections. Some of the candidates have not even started their campaigns, and those who have started, they think that the election may not take place. So that has created a kind of confusion between among the people of Afghanistan as well, among the political family as well. But what is encouraging is that the Afghan government is firm in regards to holding the elections. The Election Commission has all the needed preparations in place. And most importantly, the international community has both financially and also diplomatically backed the Afghan elections. For the people of Afghanistan, in my point of view, elections are first priority, very important, and this should take place before peace happens in the country with the Taliban. As President Ghani also explained in his remarks in Eid to the people of Afghanistan, he said the current government has come to an end of the term and cannot take any solid and big decisions in regards to important issues of the country. Therefore, elections must happen, and the new government, the new legitimate government that will come as a result of the elections should be able to decide on the peace agreement with Taliban. And I think that's what almost all Afghans, I cannot say 100%, but almost all Afghans thinking the same.
Thank you so much for being with us. Mr. Wang, let me ask you a question as to whether the path of both Kabul and the Taliban would cross, since they have a very different political agenda for their own interests. Therefore, do you foresee any real peace process, and what are the peace dividends as a result?
Frankly speaking, you're quite right that Afghan Taliban and Afghan government have very different political positions. The Afghan government, either the current president or the former president, they all want to Afghan Taliban to sit down and have talks. But Afghan Taliban always say that you are not authorized by the Afghan people. You are authorized by the United States. So that is, I think, a big differences. However, I think we see a little bit positive news since last years. I think some change happened from Afghan government side, while some other happened from Afghan Taliban side. Why Afghan Taliban side want to talk? I think the reason is very simple. because after, I think, 18 years fighting, Afghan Taliban, I believe they already realized that they cannot conquer the big cities as long as there are U.S. troops or U.S. bases in Afghanistan. So that if they can persuade or force the United States to withdraw from Afghanistan, I think by negotiation, that is really a way forward. For Afghan government side, I think either former president or the current president, Ghani, they already realized that peaceful Afghanistan should rely on the power sharing of different ethnic groups, different political factions. I think that is their beliefs. So my opinion is that there are a lot of obstacles, but there are a little bit more positive news since 2018.
Thank you. Let me go back to Mr. Jemelle. Hello. The U.S. and the Taliban have just finished their 8th round of peace talk, and will the U.S. completely withdraw all of its troops?
The Afghan National Security Forces are doing the bulk, the lion's share of the fighting against the Taliban and ISIS and other terrorist groups that are present in this country already. They've been doing so since 2014 when the transition started. So whether there are going to be any significant numbers of international forces in a year or two is irrelevant, because the bulk of the fighting is done by the Afghan forces themselves. They're the ones standing up to the Taliban, they're the ones standing up to Al-Qaeda, and they're the ones standing up to ISIS across this country. Now, the Taliban have no option, no other alternative but to sit down with the Afghan government and with the Afghan people, because the peace that they're going to make is not with the United States. The peace that they're going to make is not with any other nation in this region, because they're not at war with any other nation in this region. They're at war with the people of Afghanistan, and they're going to have to, by expediency, because they have no other option, to sit down with the Afghan people and to talk and to come to a peaceful settlement of this dispute.
The security forces of the Afghan National Security Council do deserve credit for fighting Taliban, for standing up to the IS, Al-Qaeda, and their die-hard hawks in this tribal force. However, Mr. Wang, what's the role that China plays in the post-war reconstruction since the Bush administration?
Since 2001, I think China's government really played a very important and very constructive role in the reconstruction of Afghanistan. You see, unlike Western countries, for example, United States or UK, they send a lot of troops in Afghanistan fighting the Afghan Taliban as well as other tribal soldiers, while China, we do not send any soldiers in our neighboring countries.
Thank you so much. I was able to interview former Afghan President Karzai 3 times. Here is a quick look at the video clip highlighting some of the points that I addressed with His Excellency Mr. Karzai concerning post-war reconstruction. Let's take a quick look. Do you think Afghanistan could have enough investment in the reconstruction? And where does the investment actually come from?
With peace in Afghanistan, Afghanistan will have plenty of investment in reconstruction. China will be the first to do that. China was the first to do that when Afghanistan was more stable some years ago. China invested nearly $5 billion and even more in a copper field in Afghanistan, and China invested in the oil and gas industries in Afghanistan and lots of others. So,
but what about the return of the Chinese investment in your country? Because our viewers and netizens are so seriously concerned about business deals. It's, on the one hand, humanitarian relief, of course, it's part of our mission, but,
yes, but
on the other hand, it's investment.
Yeah. Without the slightest doubt. Definitely. When peace returns to Afghanistan, so will be the profits on investment to those who have invested in Afghanistan. So I can assure the people of China, our friends in China, that with peace in Afghanistan, Chinese investment in Afghanistan will have tremendous returns for China.
That's my interview with Mr. Karzai, former president of Afghanistan, addressing the issue of post-war reconstruction. Let me go back to Mr. Jemelle. for his comments on the implications of the peace process and post-war reconstruction. Look, my understanding is that the reconstruction has played out on two major fronts. One is economic reconstruction. The other is the process of democratization for equal participation of all social groups, if possible, in Afghanistan, in using the ballot box for voting a bright future ahead of this war-torn country. Now, let's take the second point, political participation. Women's participation remains a controversial issue for the Taliban. I'm afraid that's an issue of zero tolerance for this group that believes in Islamic fundamentalism, because they have such a good relationship with the Al-Qaeda, IIS, and these groups would not have any tolerance whatsoever for women's social participation.
The Afghan president has made it abundantly clear that the Afghan people have no preconditions going into negotiations for peace. However, there are going to be preconditions for any political or potential peace settlement with the Taliban, because the thing that we do not want to compromise is the dignity of the Afghan people in return for peace, the dignity of the Afghan nation in return for peace. And the most fundamental aspect of that national dignity, the price for that which we're not willing to pay for peace, is the citizenship rights of this country under the Afghan constitution. The Afghan people are not willing to go back to become subjects again. The Afghan people are citizens under which they, in a republican system, under which they have the right, men and women, young and old, to participate in an electoral in an electoral democracy. That is a right that we're not willing to compromise. There is no precondition going into peace talks, but there are going to be preconditions during peace talks as potential outcomes of the peace talks. And top among those conditions is going to be the dignity of the Afghan nation as manifested in part by the people's willingness and their ability to participate in national decisions through elections, men, women, young and old.
Thank you. Let me go back to Madam Laluma Nasri, co-founder of and the vice president of Afghan Justice Organization, standing by there. Hello. A number of Afghans worry that the Afghan government sharing power with the Taliban could lead to a return to the group's obscurantist interpretation of Islamic justice. They are concerned that the various freedoms, notably certain women's rights, will be seriously compromised. What's your take on that?
It's not only me. All people of Afghanistan, particularly women, have great concern over the non-presence of the Afghan government in negotiation between the Taliban and the US government. Legitimacy to any peace agreements can be given by the governments. Only a group or another country cannot give legitimacy to any peace agreements in anywhere in the world. What we have been assured as the people of Afghanistan and also the Afghan government from the US government is that one of the points discussed, negotiated throughout all these rounds of negotiation in Qatar with the Taliban has been the intra-Afghan negotiations that I think will soon start between the Afghan government and the Taliban group. I just read a piece of news this morning that the Afghan government announced October 15th as the first meeting between the Afghan government and the Taliban group. I have always mentioned in my interviews, and it's very important for me as a woman, because my concern is not only the political situation in Afghanistan. Peace is very important for the people of Afghanistan. We have been through continuously through troubles, conflicts, and people are living with lots of difficulty in insecure situations. We are experiencing violence every moment in our life. It's very important that we finally witness peace in Afghanistan. But peace in the terms of Taliban are not acceptable for the people of Afghanistan unless the Afghan government is also there, and the peace agreement is also based on the terms of the government of Afghanistan, which represents the Afghan people, which has come to existence as a result of elections and as a result of our votes. But the women of Afghanistan, and particularly, have raised their concerns with the government of Afghanistan, with international community, particularly with Mr. Khalilzad, who represents the U.S. government on the negotiation with Taliban, that without the presence of the Afghan government, peace agreement will not be a real peace agreement for Afghanistan. It will not have a positive impact. The peace will not be durable and long-term, and soon violence can rise again. We have raised our concerns, and we have been assured by all the parties, excluded the Taliban, that the Afghan government will be finally part of the negotiations, and that's why the intra-government negotiation has been proposed and accepted. And as I mentioned before, the first round of talks will soon start after the elections take place. So for us as Afghans, it's very, very important that the Afghan government must be part of the negotiations, and the agreement of peace must be legitimized by the legitimate government of Afghanistan.
Thank you so much. Next, we are joined by Peter Kuznick, an American scholar of historic studies, to be with us here. He's standing by in the DC. Now, question. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, over the past 18 years, more than 2,300 U.S. servicemen and women have lost their lives and cost the U.S. taxpayers an average of $45 billion per year. So how would you conclude the war in Afghanistan? Is that really worth it?
The U.S. war in Afghanistan has been a disaster from the beginning. The United States should not have gotten involved. It was not in America's strategic interest to do so. It was part of the Bush administration's plan to remake the world. The neoconservatives in the Bush administration had a vision. They wanted to get Afghanistan out of the way so they could go after Iraq. Then after Iraq, they wanted to overthrow the government in Syria. Then they wanted to overthrow the government in Iran. They had a hit list of 7 or 8 or 9 countries that they wanted regime change in, and this vision that the Americans had for remaking the world is proven to be a failure from the beginning, an absolute disaster. This vision of a new American empire, project for a new American century. So the United States has wasted 18 years there. And for the Afghan people, we haven't done any good for the Afghan people. At the height of the war, the United States was spending $100 billion a year on military and $2 billion on sustainable development. It should have been the other way around. $100 billion on sustainable development and $2 billion on the military, or none on the military. The effort to construct an Afghan military that can stand on its own 2 feet has been a fiasco. That's been a disaster also. We have not raised standards of living in Afghanistan. We have not eliminated corruption. We have not done away with the drug trade. We've somewhat improved the status of women, but the government that the part of the reason that the Soviet government was unpopular in the 1970s was because they were supporting the improved position of women. And the forces the U.S. was supporting were opposed to the improved position of women. And now we're back to that situation again. So I would say that in every way, the U.S. effort in Afghanistan has been a failure. And everybody else who has tried to intervene there in the past has failed similarly. So, I mean, it's a very sad situation there. The standard of living is very low. Corruption is high. life expectancy is still pathetically low. I mean, so much needs to be done, but a military solution is not the way to do that. And the United States has proven that in complete waste, not only in American lives, but in Afghan lives and in NATO lives and in trillions of dollars that have been wasted in the process.
Thank you so much for being with us. Mr. Wang, other major players include Pakistan, India, Iran, Russia. We have discussed enough about what China did in Afghanistan. Recently, Afghan President Ghani visited Islamabad, and there's currently an agenda. After all, there is also a Pakistani Taliban, and there is also Afghan Taliban. Do you see any links between these two Islamic extremist groups? Do you think Pakistan can play a positive role? In Lahore, the United States attended a talk with the Taliban and the stare of Islamabad. So can you brief us on what Pakistan could do?
First question is about any links between Afghan Taliban and Pakistan Taliban. Definitely there are some kind of similarities because they use the same name, the Taliban. But frankly speaking, my opinion is that these two organizations have huge differences. Afghan Taliban is kind of integrated organization. I think they have their orders from top leaders. They have their Shura. Shura means committee. Their command system, I think, is very disciplined, comparatively speaking. But Pakistan Taliban, frankly speaking, it is kind of like an umbrella organization. And also the borders between Afghan and Pakistan up till now, although the Pakistan army is trying hard to fencing the borders between Pakistan and Afghanistan, up till now, the borders, a lot of, you cannot call that de facto borders because a lot of so many small paths so that people can just cross the so-called border because it's a long story. It is UK lived this kind of, the former UK empire in 18th century, in 19th century, they lived this kind of border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So based on this kind of reality, Pakistan do have very important roles in the futures of Afghanistan. And any final resolve of Afghan problem, we cannot leave Pakistan aside.
Yes, indeed. Many could be done, or could have been done to mitigate the negative impact of the Taliban in Afghanistan. But it is very difficult. It's going to be a long process to wipe out the ideology of Islamic extremism in this country, which faces the immediate task of economic underdevelopment, and a lot more investment would have to be made to usher in an era of prosperity for the Afghan people. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.